The wind was harsh and biting, rolling over the high plains like an unforgiving river. It swept across the silent cemetery, stirring the dry grass and the dust of years long gone. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch like the claws of some invisible beast. The only sound was the distant caw of a crow, circling above the graves. In the heart of that lonely place, a grave had been dug, its sides lined with hard-packed earth. At its edge, a wooden cross stood, weathered by time, leaning precariously to one side. No one had come. Not a soul. Her husband's funeral, the one she'd been waiting for, the one she had dreaded for months, had passed without a whisper. The preacher, an old man with a voice that cracked more than it carried, had read the rites in a hollow voice. His words, soft and distant, had barely reached her ears. They were no longer the comforting murmurs they had once been. Now, they felt like a final goodbye to a world she no longer belonged to. Ruth had been the first to notice the silence, the absence of boots on the ground, the lack of familiar faces, the hollowness that sat heavy in her chest. The town had been quick to turn their backs on her, as they always had. Ever since they had branded her husband a traitor, a coward, and worse, they had whispered about her too. It was as if the whole town had watched her fall, waiting for the final moment to come, and when it did, no one came to witness. Her hands trembled, wrapped tightly around the delicate lace handkerchief she always carried with her, the one she had sewn herself, thread by thread, hoping for a future that never came. It was the only piece of softness she had left. It was all she had to cling to in a life that had been crueler than she had ever imagined. The town had always looked at her with disdain. Ruth had never been one to care much for appearances or expectations, but even she could feel the weight of their judgment. They had accused her of witchcraft once, back when she had first arrived in the town, a stranger from the East, with a name that didn't quite fit, a history they couldn't trace, and a fire in her eyes they didn't trust. They said she was different, that she didn't belong. When her husband Jed had been taken in for questioning, they had all but forgotten her existence, leaving her to fend for herself in a world that had no use for someone like her. And yet, she had stayed. She had stayed because of love. She had stayed because, for all his faults, Jed had been the only one who had ever shown her a sliver of warmth in this desolate place. His death, whether they believed it was his fault or not, had torn her world apart. Her mind drifted to the last day she had seen him, sick with fever, his face gaunt and pale. He had begged her not to go to the town's judge, to not try and clear his name. He had warned her that the world had already decided that they wouldn't listen to a word of truth. She had fought him then, but he had won, as he always did. Now, as she stood by his grave, the realization sank deep into her bones. She had never really known him at all. Not the way she thought she did. Suddenly, she heard the sound of hooves. Distant, but growing nearer. Her heart skipped a beat. The sensation strange. In the quiet air, someone was coming. The rhythm of the hooves seemed too steady to be a stranger, too familiar to be anything else. She turned toward the sound, squinting against the harsh wind. Her eyes narrowed as a rider came into view, a lone figure against the evening sky. He was a cowboy, tall, lean, with a rugged face covered by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. There was something about him that felt different from the usual riders. Something that caught her breath and made her pulse quicken. She stood there, unmoving, watching him approach, the air thick with expectation, her hands clenched around the handkerchief, her breath quickening with every step he took. Closer. Who was this man? Why had he come? Was he here to bury her husband? Or was it something else? The horse came to a halt before her, the dust rising in its wake. The cowboy dismounted slowly, carefully. His boots hit the ground with a dull thud, and for a moment, he didn't speak. He just stood there, looking at her with eyes too dark to read. "Jed's coffin, ma'am," he said, his voice deep and steady, a quiet force that seemed to cut through the wind. "I bring him home." Her heart clenched in her chest. For the first time since Jed's death, a rush of warmth spread through her veins. Someone had come, someone remembered. But there was something more, something that made the back of her neck prickle. The way he spoke, the way he moved, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long. There was something more to this than just the funeral. She could feel it. The cowboy, without another word, turned to the wagon behind him. He reached for the ropes, and Ruth could see the edges of a wooden box covered in a thick, worn tarp. She looked back at the grave. The silence of the town was still there, pressing down on her. But in this one moment, for the briefest of seconds, something shifted. She wasn't alone anymore. As the cowboy lifted the tarp, the box he revealed wasn't just any coffin. No, this one was heavy, gleaming with something Ruth had never expected to see in a place like this. Gold, shimmering in the dying light of the day. A coffin of gold. Her eyes widened. What was this? What did it mean? The cowboy's voice was low again, carrying with it a heavy weight. "I bring what is owed to him, ma'am, and to you." Her heart beat faster. What was this man's story? What did he want from her? What did the gold mean? And why had he come now? The air seemed to freeze as the cowboy stood before her, the weight of the coffin heavy between them. Ruth could feel the coolness of the metal beneath her fingertips, the strange warmth of the moment settling in the pit of her stomach. It was almost as if time had stopped, holding its breath in the twilight of the day. The gold shimmered, its opulence foreign to everything Ruth had ever known. The town had turned its back on her. They had cast her out like a forgotten relic of another world. Yet here was this man, a stranger, bearing a gift that felt both beautiful and cursed. His eyes, dark and unreadable, bore into her as he stepped closer, lifting the coffin with ease, placing it gently on the ground beside her husband's unmarked grave. "I reckon you'll want to know why this gold's come your way," the cowboy said, his voice like gravel, rough yet steady. He didn't look at her, his eyes on the coffin, his fingers brushing over the edges of the metal as if he were trying to memorize its shape. Ruth's heart beat in her chest, slow and unsure. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She didn't know if she should thank him, accuse him, or simply ask him to leave. She had no idea what game he was playing, and the unease in her gut only deepened. "What is this?" she finally asked, her voice trembling despite herself. "What does this mean? What do you want?" The cowboy let out a long sigh, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of something heavy she couldn't see. He looked at her then, his gaze sharp and direct. There was pain in those eyes. A story he was carrying that she could feel but not understand. "It means what you need it to mean, Ruth," he replied softly, almost as if speaking to himself. "Your husband, Jed, he wasn't just a traitor like they said. He was a man who got caught in something bigger than him. And when the town turned their back on him, they didn't just take his life, they took everything he ever had." Her chest tightened as she pieced the words together, the sharp sting of realization cutting through her. You knew him?" she asked, the suspicion creeping into her voice. "How do you know all this?" The cowboy nodded slowly, his gaze falling to the ground. "I knew Jed well enough to know that when he ran, it wasn't for fear. It was to protect something, to protect someone." He paused, as if deciding whether to say more. "He didn't just betray the town, Ruth. He betrayed a man, one of their own. And when he came to me asking for help, I gave it to him. I swore to him that I'd get him out of this mess." Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. Her breath came faster, heavier, and she took a step back, her mind reeling from the weight of what he had said. "You're saying he wasn't a coward? That he didn't deserve what they did to him?" "No," the cowboy said, his voice hard now, like the crack of a whip. "He wasn't a coward. He was a man who made a mistake. A man who took the fall for something much bigger than he could handle. But it didn't stop him from trying to make things right. He knew what was coming. And when he died, Ruth, he didn't want you to know. He didn't want you to carry that burden." Her head swam with the truth she had never asked for. The betrayal, the lies, the way the town had twisted Jed's memory, it all made sense now. But why? Why hadn't he told her? Why had he kept it from her? Had he loved her so much that he thought shielding her from the truth would protect her? Or had he been ashamed? Her breath hitched, and for a moment, the weight of grief threatened to crush her. Her hands shook at her sides, and the sky above seemed to darken, as if the heavens themselves were mourning with her. The cowboy stepped forward, his eyes still locked on her. "You have every right to hate me, Ruth," he said quietly, his voice raw with something she couldn't quite place. "But I swear to you, this gold Jed earned it. He was promised it for his help, his sacrifice. And when he died, he made me promise to bring it to you, to make sure you had what was rightfully yours." Ruth felt her heart tighten in her chest, the mixture of anger and confusion swirling in her veins. She couldn't deny it. A part of her wanted to throw the gold in his face, to reject everything about this man and his offer. But another part of her, the part that had been alone in this barren town, holding on to nothing but her memories of a love that had turned bitter and cruel, couldn't help but wonder if this was a lifeline, a chance to reclaim something she had lost. "I don't know what to believe," Ruth whispered, her voice hoarse. "How do I know this is even true? How do I know you're not just here to make a mockery of everything Jed ever was?" The cowboy's face softened, and he reached into his coat, pulling out a small, weathered piece of paper. He handed it to her, and she hesitated before taking it in her hands. As she unfolded it, the words written in a careful, familiar script leapt out at her Jed's handwriting. "Tell her I'm sorry," Ruth read aloud, her voice trembling. "Tell her I never meant to hurt her." She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the weight of his words crashed down on her. This was Jed's voice, his words. She could feel him in every letter, every curve of the ink. Her fingers shook as she pressed the letter to her chest, a soft sob escaping her lips. The cowboy stepped back, his hat tipping low over his brow as he looked away. "I made sure this gold came to you. It's the last thing he could give you. He didn't want you to suffer in silence any longer, Ruth." And in that moment, Ruth understood. There would be no more answers, no more questions. The silence that had haunted her for so long, the silence of the town, the silence of her husband's death, had been broken, and in its place, something new had begun to take root. She looked at the cowboy, her eyes clear now. "What do you expect me to do with this gold?" she asked, her voice steady, though the pain in her chest had not yet eased. The cowboy met her gaze. "What you've always done, Ruth. Survive." Ruth sat in the quiet of the dusk, the heavy box of gold glinting softly in the dimming light, resting by her husband's grave. The cowboy stood a few paces away, watching her with the quiet intensity of someone who had seen too much and asked for too little in return. His horse grazed nearby, the sound of the animals chewing the only noise in the stillness of the evening. The letter burned a hole in Ruth's pocket, the ink of Jed's final words still fresh in her mind. "Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I never meant to hurt her." But the apology was meaningless. It had come too late. buried under years of silence and resentment, too deep for her to dig out in a single moment. How could a few words, a letter in a man's handwriting, undo everything the town had done to her? Undo the years of loneliness that had eaten away at her heart? She stared at the coffin of gold, the weight of it not just in its physical form, but in what it represented: money, power, the one thing the town had respected and feared. It had always been the same. Those with the gold made the rules, those with the gold were forgiven. But Jed had never cared for that. Not really. A cold wind swept across the plains, ruffling her hair and carrying with it the scent of the dry earth and the sharp, metallic tang of the coming night. Ruth pulled her coat tighter around her body, her fingers numb from the chill. The cowboy, still standing off to the side, didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. He had done his part. Now, it was up to her. "What do you want me to do with this?" Ruth asked again, her voice a little stronger now, though she still couldn't shake the tremble beneath her words. The cowboy didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be considering her question, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough, like the wind itself. "I reckon that gold's yours. It's been promised, after all. But it's not just gold," Ruth murmured, running her fingers over the edge of the box, feeling the smooth, cool surface beneath her touch. "It's the memory of him. The way he's been branded by this town. The way they all turned their backs on him. On us." Her voice caught, and she forced herself to keep it steady. "You think this gold will change that?" The cowboy took a slow, deep breath, and for the first time, Ruth saw a flicker of something beneath his hardened exterior. Pain, regret, perhaps even understanding. He took a step closer to her, his boots crunching against the dry ground. "It's a start," he said softly, "but it won't change what's been done. It won't make them love him, or you, any more than they did before. Not unless you do something about it." He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. Jed never wanted to run. He never wanted to betray the people here. But they forced his hand. Ruth. They made him choose. And he chose to protect what he loved: his family. "You." She clenched her fists at her sides. "And what good is it now? He's dead, and I'm left with a pile of gold and the weight of all the lies they told." The cowboy nodded, his face grave. "The weight of a lie is heavy, ma'am. I know that well enough." But the truth, he let the words hang in the air for a long time. The truth always comes out, even if it's buried beneath dirt and shame. And you've got a chance now to set things right. You've got a chance to take back what was stolen from you. Ruth's gaze flickered to the grave where her husband lay, and the weight of his absence crushed down on her. How could she take anything back? She had nothing. Nothing but the memory of a love she had once believed was enough to carry her through. Now, that love felt like a lie, a cruel joke. She reached down, her fingers trembling as they brushed over the gold, the coolness of it a stark contrast to the fire building in her chest. "You don't know what it's like," she said, the words coming out in a harsh whisper. "To be accused of something you didn't do, to be outcast and betrayed, to carry that shame like a brand on your soul." The cowboy didn't flinch. He simply stood there, his face unreadable, his hands folded across his chest. "Maybe not," he replied. "But I know what it's like to lose everything. And I know what it's like to keep going, to survive. And I reckon that's what you've got to do now. Survive." Ruth closed her eyes, feeling the bitter sting of his words. Survive. That's what she had been doing all along, hadn't she? But now, with this gold before her, with the weight of the truth and the lies pressing down on her, survival didn't seem like enough. She looked at the cowboy, seeing him for what he truly was, Someone who had come into her life not to save her, but to give her the tools to save herself. "You don't have to stay," she said, her voice steady now, the sharp edge of defiance creeping in. "But I'm not going to run anymore." He nodded once, as if acknowledging a pact between them, and took a step back. "You don't have to, ma'am," he said. "But just remember, you've got more than gold now. You've got the truth. And you've got the choice." For the first time in a long while, Ruth felt something stir within her, a flicker of hope. Small, but real. She wasn't alone anymore. She had the truth. She had the power to stand up and fight. But the real battle wouldn't be with the gold. It would be with the town that had branded her husband a traitor, with the people who had turned their backs on her. And it wouldn't be won by force. It would be won by the quiet act of defiance, the smallest crack in the silence of the town that would echo louder than any gunshot. She stood, her body stiff but resolute, and looked down at her husband's grave once more. "I'll make sure they know the truth," she whispered, "and I'll make sure they never forget." The cowboy tipped his hat to her, turned, and mounted his horse without another word. He didn't need to say anything else. Ruth had made her choice. The sun rose early the next day, casting long shadows over the land, and the town ahead seemed smaller, quieter than Ruth remembered. The streets were still, save for the occasional stray dog slinking through the alleyways, avoiding the midday heat. The buildings loomed in silence, their windows cracked and dull, as if the town itself had grown weary, too tired to care anymore. Ruth walked into the town, with the coffin of gold hidden beneath the worn tarp in her wagon. The weight of it felt like a steady drumbeat, one that echoed with every step she took, though the heavy box was not the only burden she carried. It was not just the gold, it was the truth, the knowledge of what had happened, what had been done to her, to Jed, to their lives. The town's sins were buried deep, but now they had to be unearthed. It was a long walk into town, and as she neared, the familiar faces of the townsfolk began to appear at the edges of the street. Ruth didn't flinch. She had nothing to fear anymore. Their cold stares, the whispers, the gossip, they meant nothing. Nothing could touch her now. She was past that. At the saloon, the usual crowd of men sat at their tables, nursing drinks that stained the wooden counters, but when they saw her, they fell silent. Ruth didn't stop, didn't look their way. She kept her gaze forward, focused on the path ahead. Behind her, a few of them murmured, their voices like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Is that her?" one asked, a rough, familiar voice. "Is she really back?" "Don't know, but it sure looks like her," another voice replied, tinged with disbelief. Her heart tightened, but she refused to let it show. She'd heard their whispers for years, their accusations, their lies. She had carried the burden of their distrust alone, and she would not let them take her down now, not now that she knew the truth. As she passed the old general store, the bell above the door jingled faintly. The shopkeeper, a pale, thin man with watery eyes, watched her pass, his face unreadable. She paused, just for a moment, to look him in the eye. She knew him well, knew how he had looked the other way when Jed had been dragged through the streets, how he had nodded with approval when the town had thrown stones at her, calling her a witch. "Morning, Ruth," he said, his voice tight. She nodded back but didn't say a word. She had no words left for him. He had chosen his side. She had chosen hers. The walk to the sheriff's office was short, but by the time she reached it, her mind had already begun to spin with the inevitable confrontation ahead. They would come for her. She could feel it. The town couldn't let go of its hate so easily. They would fight to keep their power, to hold on to their version of the truth. They would resist. But Ruth was ready. The sheriff's office stood at the far end of Main Street, near the old courthouse, its wooden walls sagging under the weight of years. The sheriff, a tall, heavy-set man with a thick mustache, sat behind his desk, his feet propped up, reading the paper. He looked up when Ruth entered, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of her standing in the doorway, the wagon with the coffin of gold just behind her. "Well, well," he drawled, his tone oozing with a mix of suspicion and amusement. "Look what the wind blew in." Ruth's jaw tightened. She could hear the mockery in his voice, the same voice that had sentenced her husband without a trial, the same voice that had helped to bury Jed's name along with his body. She stepped forward, pushing the door closed behind her with a soft creak. "I've come to claim what's mine," she said, her voice steady, though she could feel the tremor beneath it. "And to make sure you understand the truth." The sheriff stood, slowly, his chair scraping across the floor. His hand hovered near the pistol on his belt. But Ruth didn't flinch. She had come too far to be intimidated now. "I reckon you've got something to say, Ruth," he said, his voice low and threatening, like the growl of a caged animal. "But I don't think anyone here is interested in your truth. Not after all that's happened." She reached into her wagon, pulling the tarp away with a slow, deliberate movement, revealing the coffin of gold. The sheriff's eyes flickered, just for a moment, and Ruth saw the shift in his expression, the way his face tightened, his jaw clenching. "You're right," she said softly. "No one's interested in the truth, but it's time they learned to listen." She set the coffin down carefully, its weight heavy on the ground as it thudded against the dirt floor. She didn't look at the sheriff, didn't look at anyone else who might have gathered in the office. She only had eyes for the gold. Ruth didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She let the silence settle between them like dust. Finally, she spoke again, her words clear and unyielding. "This gold is what Jed earned," she said, her eyes never leaving the coffin. "It was promised to him for his loyalty, his sacrifice. You and the others can keep calling him a traitor, but that doesn't change the truth. He was a man who gave everything for a cause you couldn't understand." The sheriff's hand twitched at his side, but he didn't draw his gun. Instead, he stepped forward, his boots heavy on the floor. He looked down at the coffin, his eyes hardening. "That's so?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "And you think you can just walk in here, lay down that pile of gold, and expect us to turn around and say sorry?" "I'm not asking for an apology," Ruth replied, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm asking you to remember what you did, what you took from us, and to look at what remains." She nodded toward the coffin. "The truth. The gold isn't the prize, it's the proof. The proof that you were wrong, Sheriff." There was a long pause, the tension thick and heavy, and Ruth felt the weight of the sheriff's gaze on her. She had no illusions about what was to come. This wouldn't be easy. But she wasn't alone. Not anymore. She had the truth, the gold, and the strength to stand her ground. "You want your revenge, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice low, a challenge in the air. "Take it. But know that I'm not running anymore." The sheriff stood still for a long time, his heavy eyes fixed on Ruth, a tension between them as sharp as the edge of a knife. The room seemed to close in around them, the dust motes floating lazily in the dim light, the faint smell of tobacco and sweat mixing in the air. Ruth's heart was steady, though, its rhythm slow and deliberate, her breath coming evenly as she met his gaze. Lingering near the gun belt at his waist, but Ruth didn't flinch. She didn't move an inch. There was something in her now, a quiet defiance that would not yield to anyone, least of all the men who had betrayed her, who had buried her husband's name in the dirt and left her to rot. "I don't know what you think you're proving," the sheriff said at last, his voice low, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You bring gold, you bring words, but you can't change what's been done. It's over, Ruth. It was over when your husband chose to run." Ruth stepped forward, her boots scraping against the floor, and placed her hand flat on the coffin. The gold shimmered in the flickering candlelight, its shine dull compared to the fire that burned in her chest. "No," she said firmly, her voice quiet but powerful. "It wasn't over when Jed died, and it isn't over now." There was a moment of stillness, as if the whole town had drawn a breath. She could feel the eyes of the people in the room on her, their gazes like the heat of a brand, judging, questioning, waiting for her to break. But she wouldn't, not anymore. She had the truth now, and she would carry it with her no matter the cost. The sheriff shifted, his jaw clenched, but he didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he turned away, walking to the window and staring out at the dusty street. Ruth watched him, her mind racing through the last moments of her life, the years of loneliness, of silence, of pain, and what it had brought her to now. "You want to make a stand here, Ruth?" the sheriff finally said, his voice low, weary. "You want to make the town care after all this time?" "I don't care if the town cares," Ruth replied, her voice soft but sharp as a whip. "I care that Jed's name lives on, that he's remembered for what he was, not what you made him out to be. That's what matters." The sheriff turned back to her, his face hardening again, but something had shifted in his eyes. Maybe it was the way she said Jed's name. Maybe it was the quiet strength that now ran through her, like the current of a river. But there was no mistaking the change in the air. "You think they'll listen to you?" he asked, a trace of bitterness in his voice. "You think you can make them listen now, after everything?" Ruth took a step toward him, standing tall in the midst of his looming presence, and looked him in the eye. "I don't need them to listen, Sheriff. I've spent my whole life waiting for that. I need them to see the truth." Her words echoed in the silence that followed. She wasn't just standing up for Jed anymore. She was standing up for herself, for the woman she had become, for the strength she had forged in the fire of everything that had broken her. She would not be the woman they had accused her of being. She would not be a victim. Not anymore. The sheriff's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Ruth saw the weariness in his face, not just the fatigue of the day or the exhaustion of his duties, but the weight of years spent holding on to lies, trying to control a town that had long since started to crumble beneath him. "You've always been a fighter, Ruth," he muttered. "I'll give you that. But there's more to this than gold and truth." She nodded. "I know. But gold can buy what's needed for the truth to be heard. And truth can buy something else, something they can't take back." She turned then, and with a deep breath, she stepped out into the street. The gold in the coffin behind her seemed to shine brighter, its gleam reflected in the setting sun. The town was still quiet, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't the oppressive hush of the past, the stillness of abandonment. It was the quiet before a storm, the tension of something about to change. As she passed the saloon again, the men who had been watching her earlier no longer whispered. They no longer looked away, but their eyes followed her. And for the first time, there was something else in their gazes. Not fear, not mockery, but something like respect. Something that made her chest tighten with an emotion she hadn't expected. She walked past the general store, where the shopkeeper's face was no longer expressionless, his eyes softening. For just a moment, the weight of their judgment had shifted. It wasn't gone, but it had been cracked, and that was enough for Ruth. When she reached the cemetery, the sun was nearly gone, the last of its light, painting the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. She stood for a moment by Jed's grave, her hand on the coffin of gold. "I've made it, Jed," she whispered, her voice low, barely a breath against the wind. "I've made it through. I'll make sure they remember you. I'll make sure they know the truth." The wind picked up, ruffling her hair, and in the distance, she heard the faint sound of hooves, distant, but growing nearer. Her heart gave a small jolt, and for a moment, she wondered if the cowboy had returned, if he had come back to see the end of this. But then, the sound faded, and Ruth knew it didn't matter. She didn't need him anymore. She didn't need anyone. She had found her own strength, and that was enough. She stood tall, the gold glimmering behind her, and though the battle wasn't over, Ruth knew this was the first step. The town would hear the truth. It would be messy, it would be hard, but it would be undeniable. She had survived, and that was all she needed. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe my channel.